The Ottoman Empire lasted for 600 years and dominated the Middle East and Europe, from Budapest to Baghdad and everything in between. Its sultans ruled 3 continents, but they didn't do it on their own. This podcast looks at the cast of characters who made the empire run: the sultan, the queen mother, the harem eunuch, the merchant, the peasant, the janissary, the holy man, and the outlaw. Welcome to Ottoman Lives. In the 19th century, when European travelers went to the Ottoman Empire, something that they almost always mentioned were the whirling dervishes. The dervishes, whose name means those who have chosen the road of suffering, had a religious ceremony where they would wear long flowing robes and cone-shaped hats and spin around together in formation, so a group of them make this whirling motion in order to perform mystical aspects of their faith. So one early 19th century writer described it as, "Their curious, beautiful, and mysterious dance induced a dream of order and beauty produced out of chaos, or the harmonic revolutions of the planetary systems." The reason they're performing this ritual is in celebration of the Sufi poet Gelatin Rumi, who lived in the Turkish city of Konya in the 13th century. He was from Afghanistan, but he was fleeing the Mongol invasions. The legend goes that he's said to have invented whirling when he first spun himself into an ecstatic trance in the 13th century. And this ritual is performed frequently in Turkey today, and if you ever watch any tourism promotional videos from the Turkish Ministry of Culture, there is a 100% chance that they're going to show images of the whirling dervishes. So they'd be costumed in robes and lofty cone-shaped hats, and they would dance to music that contains a flute, a zither, a drum, and a woodwind instrument, a lute. And by doing the action, they're celebrating the writings of Rumi, who wrote a lot on theology and mysticism, and he's widely beloved today in not only the Islamic world, but a lot of other parts of the world as well. Rumi was born in Afghanistan in 1207, and by the time he died in 1273, he was widely revered for his quest for spiritual enlightenment. He's best known as the author of the 26,000 couplet Mesnevi, which expresses spiritual devotion, and one legend says that he dictated it to a scribe while whirling around a pillar in his home. He said that dancing is not rising to your feet painlessly like a speck of dust blown around the wind. Dancing is when you rise above both worlds, tearing your heart to pieces and giving up your soul. So the dance that the whirling dervishes do, which is called the sema, has a lot of symbolism, where one hand is stretched upward, the idea is they take wisdom from God, and then another hand is put downward where they pass it on to man. The conical hat that they wear is said to represent the dervish's tombstone, and the white tunic they wear is his funeral shroud. The whirling itself is supposed to represent an attempt to see God in every direction of the compass, the rotation of the planets, and the cycle of seasons. And the flute that plays the same tune over and over and over again is supposed to represent the sound of the trumpet that will awake the dead on Judgment Day. All right, so that's a little bit of a description of the whirling dervish ceremony. But it's a really good entry point to discuss religion in the Ottoman Empire. And in this episode of Ottoman Lives, we're going to be looking at the figure of the holy man. This religious ceremony, the whirling dervishes, is celebrated by a religious order called the Rumi, and it was started by this man who was a poet. He wasn't a theologian. And that's a good way to describe the kind of scattered religious practice that existed in the Ottoman Empire. You had really orthodox practices of Islam, where scholars would receive traditional training, they would know Arabic, they would know traditional Islamic sources, but then you had these heterodox breakaway groups like the Rumi. You had more mystical practices of Islam that, if we're going to compare things in a European context, like in Europe, you might have high Catholicism practiced by priests, but then you would have the Protestant Reformation. You would have much more simple practices of faith that would be done by Puritans or Baptists or people that didn't have any religious ornamentation. Now, the analogy isn't perfect because there was never really anything like a Reformation within Islam where there was a conscious break within the religion. There's a Sunni-Shia split. I'm not going to get into all that. But the point being is that in the Ottoman Empire, you have the orthodox high Islam, but then you have the low Islam, where you can have mystical groups and mystical orders and dervishes and religious figures that are seen as a lot more unruly and that authorities really don't like very much because they're not decentralized and they're not stitched into the mainstream of Islam. The Ottoman Empire also has a lot of mountains, and if you want to understand how religious heterodoxy works, if you just look at a map and find where the mountain ranges are, you can almost perfectly pinpoint where breakaway religious groups or heterodox religious groups will be, because if you're up in the mountain, you can just evade authorities much more easily. You're not going to be controlled by central authorities as much because the taxman won't come up as frequently, the army won't go up there as frequently, and other government functionaries won't go up there. So if you have a breakaway religious movement that you want to practice, the mountains are where it's at. So that is a little glimpse into the complexity of religion in the Ottoman Empire. In this episode, I'm going to be focusing on all the differences within Islam, but you could find plenty of practice of Judaism in the Ottoman Empire in cities like Thessalonica. Christianity is all over the place in the Ottoman Empire. The head of the Orthodox Church is still in Istanbul today, the ecumenical patriarch. So there are lots of Orthodox Christians. There are Catholics there, starting with Franciscans going into the Balkans. With the Protestant Reformation, there are Protestant missionaries who come in the 1800s. And there are Christians who convert from Orthodoxy or Catholicism to Protestantism. So every stripe of Christianity that you could imagine is in there as well. So you'll find way more religious diversity in the Ottoman Empire than you would in probably any European country or the United States today. The difference is that the Ottoman Empire wasn't trying to create this universal identity of being an Ottoman citizen. From the government standpoint, they were happy for these different groups of people to do their own thing, speak their own language, practice their own religion. And as long as they didn't create riots, no harm. But what did religious practice look like, and what was it like to be a holy man in the Ottoman Empire? Let's take a look at that right now. If you were a holy man, at least from the Islamic sense, you were a member of the ulama, if you were part of the official religious class. Ulama is the plural Arabic word of alim, which means man of knowledge. And that refers, in the Ottoman context, to those who were trained in the Islamic religious sciences, like the Quran, the traditions of Muhammad, and Islamic law, or Sharia. The Ottoman Empire had its religious establishment as part of its government. The Ottomans divided their society into two big groups. The tax-paying subjects, or re'aya, which means flock, and I talked about this in our episode on the peasant. The other class was the privileged soldier class, and the soldier class was distinguished between men of the sword, which were the soldiers, or men of the pen, bureaucrats, and men of knowledge, the religious sciences, so men of the religious establishment. And religious sciences were taught in madrasas, which were like religious schools, but really they were just about the only schools that you could go to. Between the 14th and 16th centuries, the Ottomans built some 350 madrasas, and half of them in the 16th century, especially when the Ottoman Empire is growing in power and it has a lot more tax revenue. In the early Ottoman Empire, the ulama of the empire were trained in the major centers of Islamic learning. Those who wanted to study interpretation of the Quran or jurisprudence went to Egypt or Iran. The most important part of Islamic education, however, it wasn't the institution, it was the teacher. It was his expertise that determined the subjects and books that were taught in the madrasa. But there was still a strict hierarchy of them. The highest ranking schools were those in the capital, Istanbul, that were built by Mehmet the Conqueror in the 1450s up to the 1480s. Islamic religious sciences dominated the curriculum, but you could also learn medicine and astronomy. Upon mastering a given subject or text, the student received a certificate of education from his teacher. This showed that the student mastered the specific text or subject, and he was authorized to teach it to others. And in addition to getting training from the religious sciences, a holy man also had to get patronage from an influential person. This was necessary for a career within the ulama. So a graduate from one of the main Istanbul schools had two career choices. They either pursued a life as a professor or became a judge, where you had to know Islamic law, and this made you a member of the Ottoman administration. In the Ottoman Empire, there was a firm hierarchy within the ulama and strict rules regarding promotion. Madrasa graduates sought employment with the state either as teachers or as judges, and were registered in the government books of state appointees, and they waited until a position became available for which their education qualified them. And I just want to point out here that, at least in Middle Eastern history, this wasn't always the state where the religious establishment was controlled by the government. There were many times when the religious establishment had independent power from the government and sometimes had power over the government, kind of like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages in Europe, when it was parallel to kings and dukes and barons. Sometimes it had power over them, sometimes it was under their thumb. And in Europe, at least, it's not really until you get to the Reformation age when individual princes or kings can claim power over Christianity, kind of like with Henry VIII. He has his own national church. It's a breakaway from the Catholic Church. But the Ottoman Empire, at least, is able to firmly control religious groups. Of course, there are always breakaway scholars, there are breakaway holy men who can lead rebellions, especially with dervishes, with heterodox Muslims. But overall, the Ottoman Empire has control over its religious class. This is one of the many reasons why the empire lasts for centuries. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what it looks like to climb the ranks as a holy man. A teacher or a muderis of a lower level school were eligible for judgeships in smaller towns. And you could earn some good money. You'd earn between 50 to 150 akshas per day. An aksha was a unit of currency in the mid-16th century. For example, by comparison, the Janissaries earned 5 to 6 akshas per day. If you were a senior judge, you could earn 300 akshas or more per day and could become finance ministers of the imperial council. So the career paths to the secular bureaucracy were also open to ulama, many of whom became advisors or even grand viziers, which were the sultan's deputies and heads of the government. The head of the Ottoman ulama was the Shaykhul Islam, the chief judge in Istanbul. He was appointed by the Sultan from among the most distinguished scholars of the religious sciences. He wasn't a member of the Imperial Council, but he could have a tie-breaking vote when there was disagreement in the Imperial Council or they sought a religious opinion. The Shaykhul Islam gave legal opinions called a fatwa, and the fatwas that he wrote that could untangle sticky legal matters were sort of like Supreme Court verdicts. They would determine law in future cases that came up against the same issue. Since the Shaykhul Islam represented Islamic sacred law, he wasn't officially part of the government, but he was given the right and obligation to appoint judges. They were arms of the executive branch of the government. So the institutionalization of the Ottoman ulama and its close association with the government was unprecedented in other Islamic governments. So in the long run, this reduced their ability to act as mediators between the governors and the subjects, and these are functions that had been traditionally associated with the ulama. In the history of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman ulama from the mid-16th century onward is usually portrayed as a reactionary force that rejected government reforms that the Ottomans needed to do to catch up with Europe. And this is partly true because the coalition of the ulama and the Janissaries opposed military reforms in the 1800s, and this led to the Sultan's deposition. But the ulama wasn't homogenous, and there were reformist factions, there were conservative factions, and in the 1800s you have ulama scholars that become acquainted with Western philosophy. Some of them can read French, they're incorporating Western Enlightenment thinking in their own religious ideas. This is among reform members, but then you have more conservative members that are not doing this at all. So there's a whole spectrum there. The Ottoman reforms, called the Tanzimat reforms from 1839 to 1876, to try to introduce a constitution to the Ottoman Empire, to give universal rights to all subjects, seriously reduced the role and influence of the ulama, that at this point had become a closed class. With the introduction of secular schools and secular courts as part of the overhauling of the educational and judicial systems of the empire, the ulama's traditional functions were weakened. On the one hand, the Shaykhul Islam's right to appoint and supervise judges was left untouched, and his office was enlarged and developed into a ministry in all but name. But the establishment of the Ministry of Religious Foundations and its merger with the Imperial Mint weakened the ulama's hold on these important assets. The privileged existence of the ulama was terminated with the abolition of the caliphate in 1924 with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and founding of the Turkish Republic. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about education and what it looks like with holy men, because religious people had an enormous amount of influence. The curriculum in the palace school of the Ottoman Empire included traditional subjects and rational sciences. You'd learn the Islamic sciences like I just mentioned, and also calligraphy, Arabic, rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, history, mathematics, and geography. But in palace schools, you'd also have to focus on military and administrative subjects. Madrasas were the most important educational institutions in the empire. So there was really no secular education. It was all religious education, really up into the 1800s. You could go to a primary school called Sibyan Mektepleri, and the object of these schools was to teach children how to read, write, and to have them memorize passages from the Quran and precepts of Islam. In their last years at school, students would read dictionaries in Arabic and Persian rendered in verse. So if you were a holy man, you almost definitely had to read Arabic. You had to read the Quran in Arabic. You couldn't use Turkish translations. There really aren't any Turkish translations until the 1800s, and they're not even considered Qurans. They're just considered interpretations of it. Persian was also good to know from a poetic standpoint, and if you were a member of the Rumi order, a whirling dervish, you definitely had to know Persian because that's what Rumi wrote his poetry in. So as a holy man, you were almost always a teacher at one of these schools, and you would teach the empire's elite, but you could also teach a broad spectrum of people that came from different backgrounds in the Ottoman Empire. For the most part, you provided them equal educational opportunities and the promise of social mobility. So this educational system provided by holy men sought to create cultural uniformity and a common worldview among different groups to form an Ottoman Muslim elite with shared goals and values. If you were a holy man, you didn't just teach. You did a lot of other things for the state, and you also weren't just a judge. And to understand what this looks like, we can actually look at a school, its physical structure, and all the things associated with it to get a sense of what a holy man did. Madrasas, these schools, were usually built next to hospitals and sometimes included astronomical observatories. So the founders were interested in the sciences of medicine and astronomy. In addition to teaching these subjects, you could also perform them right there practically. You might teach an Arabic class in the morning, perform a simple surgery later on in the afternoon, and then get out your astronomical lathe and do some calculations in the evening. You had a lot of freedom because education in the early Ottoman madrasa was left to the initiative of the teacher, in accordance with the terms stipulated by the founders or those who left the endowment. You could choose the subject to be studied, teacher qualifications, teacher hours, payment to be made to teachers, and student stipends. So what we're seeing here is that if you're a holy man, there's a very close tie to education here. One of the biggest educational and religious complexes was in Istanbul, and it was called the Fatih Mosque Complex, or Fatih Külliyesi. And according to the deed that established it, it was to be made up of 8 upper-level madrasas and 8 preparatory schools. It was also to have a primary school and a library. It also included a hospital, lodgings, and a soup kitchen that served the poor. These soup kitchens were really important when there'd be waves of immigration into Istanbul. And a lot of people did immigrate to the capital if their homeland was destroyed by a rebellion or there was a crop failure. The deeds of the Fatih Madrasa said that they were based on the principles of science and wisdom. They included virtue, talent, religion, and canon law. And they were to be dedicated to the development of human capacities and faculties. This deed stipulated that teachers would be selected from scholars who knew both the religious and rational sciences, such as logic, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. This is for the Fatih complex. These stipulations were not universally the case in all schools in the Ottoman Empire. The curriculum was prepared by renowned scholars of the time, including a mathematician from Samarkand, Ali Kuşçu. Now, the zenith of Ottoman education and religious works and social works happened in the Süleymaniye complex. The Süleymaniye Mosque was commissioned by Sultan Süleyman, who was the most powerful sultan in the Ottoman Empire. He ruled from 1520 to 1566. He commissioned a massive mosque that is still highly visible in Istanbul today because it's on a big hill. And the complex included the mosque, but also schools, a madrasa, a hospital, a public kitchen, a convalescence hospital, a pharmacy. So if you were a holy man, you could be leading prayers, but then you might have to fill out a prescription order. And there were specialized schools within here. There was a specialized school for medicine. This was considered the highest ranking school in the empire, and its teachers were the most honor, and they also made the most money. So if you taught here, and you want to go to another city in the Ottoman Empire, as an instructor, as a holy man, you could basically write your ticket anywhere. Well, education changes and the role of the holy man changes in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century because the Ottoman Empire goes through a period of radical change. they introduced modern institutions of education that are based more on European models. The education reform movement began in the army. It was born out of the need to prevent further defeats in the battlefield and to regain Ottoman military superiority. And these educational reforms were extended from just the military and different tactics and drill formations and metallurgy, and were extended into civilian areas. In the 18th century, the Ottomans focused on acquiring the cultural and technical skills of Europe. This modernization project focused on 3 areas: shipbuilding techniques, engineering, and modern medicine. So the emphasis on the Islamic sciences within education slowly diminishes over time. I mean, it definitely never disappears in the Ottoman Empire, but over the 19th century, it goes down and down and down over time. Okay, so that's what official government-sanctioned religious practice looks like. Now I want to look at religious orders that were considered heterodox. And historians don't really like the term heterodox and orthodox because they think that that's more for the realm of theology. If you were to ask a historian what orthodox or heterodox means, they would argue that it has to do with power. If the government officially endorses one view, it doesn't matter what that view is, then that view is orthodox. The government does not endorse a view, then that view is heterodox. So that's the historian's definition. But if you were to ask a theologian, then they would have a much different answer, and they would say it has nothing to do with government power, it has to do with the beliefs themselves. So let's use the historian's definition because this is a history podcast. Now let's look at heterodox religious views. We're going to look at the Bektashi order. This was a mystical practice of Islam that sometimes enjoyed government support, sometimes did not, and sometimes ran in direct conflict with it. The Bektashi order is a sect of Sufism, which is a mystical expression of Islam, that was popular among the peasants of Anatolia. This was not elite religious practice, this was your common folk religion. It was popular in the Balkans from the founding of the Ottoman Empire until its end. It's still popular in some places like Albania. The order had little appeal for Muslim intellectuals and other urban Sunnis who thought it was a religion for peasants that had beliefs that bordered on heresy. The Bektashi order was perhaps most famous for being the interpretation of Islam that was embraced by the Janissaries. That relationship between members of the order and the Janissary Corps gave the group a political dimension as well as a spiritual one. But when the Janissaries were destroyed in 1826, this was also a huge blow for Bektashiism. The origins of the order is said to have been with Haji Bektash. He was a mystic who came to Anatolia in the 13th century from Iran. The order's practices were highly unorthodox for Sunni Muslims, as they blended elements of Islam with pre-Islamic Turkish shamanism, and this is the religion that Turks practiced, a belief system that holds that all living things, human, animal, or vegetable, shared a common soul and communicated with by shamans. The fusion between shamanism and Islam had great appeal for the nomadic Turkoman tribes that migrated out of Central Asia and into Anatolia in the 12th to 14th centuries. Missionaries from the order helped speed the conversion of these tribes to Islam by placing Muslim religious figures such as Muhammad and his son-in-law Ali into shamanistic legends and by presenting acts of magic similar to those worked by shamans. So it sounds like the spread of Christianity into Europe, where priests would incorporate Christian belief into pagan or Viking cosmology. The syncretism between the old religion and the new made the transition from one belief system to another easier for the tribesmen. In the 14th century, members of the Bektashi religious order began serving as chaplains and spiritual guides to the Janissary Corps. And by the 16th century, it was established practice that all members of those elite military units were inducted into the order because Haji Bektash was viewed as the guiding spirit of the Janissaries, sort of like a patron saint for Christian orders. So not all adherents to Bektashi Sufism were Janissaries, but all Janissaries were expected to take vows of obedience to the Bektashi spiritual guides. Orthodox Muslims considered the beliefs of the Bektashi order to be extreme, sometimes heretical. The Bektashis consumed wine, which was not allowed in mainstream Islam. They allowed dancing in their religious services. Unveiled women could attend and participate in the religious services, which scandalized mainstream Muslims. Bektashis believed in a trinity that consisted of God, the Prophet Muhammad, and Ali. They celebrated religious days of Shia Islam, and when pressed, some members would say that they were Shia Muslims, which is scandalous because the Ottoman Empire was a very, very Sunni Muslim empire. It'd be like going to Italy in the 1600s and find a religious order that was secretly Protestant. The Bektashi order also had beliefs of numerology that was kind of similar to Jewish Kabbalah. The Bektashi's connection to the Janissaries was perhaps the only reason the order didn't face persecution from the Ottoman authorities. The Bektashi order also had practices that resembled Christianity. They offered communion of bread and wine in their religious services and encouraged celibacy for men and women who resided in their convents or their lodges. Historians have suggested that just as the Bektashi blended shamanistic practices to appeal to Turkoman tribesmen, these elements were added to appeal to Christian peasants in Anatolia and the Balkans. In fact, these Bektashi practices did have wide appeal to Christians in the empire, and some scholars think that many Christians converted due to missionary work of the Bektashis. The order provided former Christians with the political benefits of becoming Muslim, while allowing them to participate in religious ceremonies that seemed similar to those of their former faith. After the abolition of the Janissary Corps in 1826, the Ottoman government closed many of the Bektashi lodges as the order was seen as being too close to the Janissaries. But it didn't outlaw it altogether. This leniency was based on the understanding of the grassroots popularity of the Bektashi order among peasants. There was a Bektashi revival in the Ottoman Balkans in the late 19th century among Albanians and Bosnians as the political situation in the empire deteriorated, and many Muslims sought spiritual comfort from religious traditions that survived in the villages of the empire. The government of the newly formed Turkish Republic banned the Bektashi order, along with all other Sufi orders, because the Turkish Republic wanted to control religion even more than the Ottoman Empire. So traditional Sunni Orthodox Islam was the order of the day, although it was heavily watered down in the new secular republic. The founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal, thought that these old religious orders offered a potential political threat to his new regime, and he thought they also represented a superstitious past from which he sought to free the new Turkish Republic. Enver Hoxha in Albania also banned the Bektashi order in the 1960s. This is at a time when approximately a third of the country consider themselves to be Bektashi. And since the fall of communism in Albania, there's been a revival of the order in the Balkans, marking the reopening of some of the Bektashi lodges and public celebration of Bektashi feast days and commemorations. One final thing I want to mention is that there seems to be a bit of truth in Ataturk's assessment of dervishes, that they could represent instability in the Ottoman political order. There's a wonderful book by Ahmet Kara Mustafa called God's Unruly Friends, Dervish Groups in the Islamic Later Middle Period, 1200 to 1550, and how these holy men practice a folk religion that was very popular among the public but threatened the political order. And this is confirmed by accounts from Western travelers like Ruy González de Clavijo, and in 1500 the Italian nobleman and Ottoman captive Giovanni Antonio Menviso. He describes their behavior as, "We're told their behavior elevated the aesthetic principles of itinerary celibacy and self-mortification to new heights. They were routinely dismissed as the riffraff of society, impostors and ignoramuses, and swindlers and opportunists of the ignorant masses." So religion in the Ottoman Empire, sometimes it was highly institutionalized, politicized, unbending, and prohibitive. But then there could be these uncontrolled groups as well that could be considered by elites as much more unruly. So there is a view of dervishes as being anarchist and only belonging to the sphere of popular religion and low culture. But there's a huge amount of gray between the high normative and official religion of the elite on one hand and low culture on the other. So there's a lot of crossover between these two as well. And part of the reason for this division is to constantly strip dervish orders of their significance and render them inconsequential to the wider understanding of Ottoman religion. All right, well, that is all for today's episode. In our final episode in our series on Ottoman lives, we're going to be looking at the person of the outlaw. Thanks for listening to this episode. For more information, including show notes, maps, and a bibliography, go to OttomanLives.com. Also, if you like this show, please rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. It helps us grow the show and make it easier for new listeners to discover us. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.